I did mine on how does the U.S. prison system uphold slavery. The U.S. population is a staggering 332,403,650 people. Black Americans count for 13% of our present-day population, yet they make up 38% of our prison population. In a 2021 article titled "The Color of Justice, Racial and Ethnic Disparity in State Prisons" by Ashley Nellis, they stated that Black Americans were 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white Americans, and that more than half of incarcerated individuals are Black in 12 state prisons. How did these discrepancies occur on the so-called land of the free, and how have they been preserved for over 150 years? The beginning can be traced back to the 13th Amendment. Signed into law by Abraham Lincoln in 1865 to the U.S. Constitution, it supposedly abolished slavery in the United States. However, written in the heart of the amendment was a loophole that became heavily exploited for over a century. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Slavery was outlawed, but if a person were to be convicted of a crime fairly and legally, slavery was a legal course of action that the convicted could be condemned to. This loophole led to the country's burgeoning prison labor system and the world's largest prison population at 2.3 million in 2020, according to Caroline M. Kessel in her 2021 article. After the passing of the 13th Amendment, the first Black codes were passed the same year by states such as Mississippi and South Carolina. These codes were laws that specified how, when, and where newly freed slaves could work, as well as how much they were paid. Loitering and vagrancy were crimes that Black Americans could be criminalized under. Through the passing of these laws, the codes led to the sudden mass incarceration of newly freed Black Americans who found themselves in the same place they had started, but now there is no one fighting for their freedom, as they are now criminals. In Connie Hassett Walker's 2020 article, published by the American Bar Association, she stated it best: the Black codes maintained the de facto structure of slavery without formally calling it slavery. While the Black codes were short-lived in the post-Civil War South, it laid the foundation for the Jim Crow laws that preserved through the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Shortly after the dismantlement of the Jim Crow era with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Nixon administration in 1971 declared drug abuse to be the public enemy #1, launching the war on drugs. Drug abuse and drug abusers were commercialized as dangerous enemies to the general law-abiding public, and criminal sentencing for such crimes toughened over the years. In the midst of the war on drugs, crack cocaine was introduced to the American public and hit heavily in predominantly Black communities in urban areas. Under the Reagan administration, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was passed, which established mandatory minimum sentencing for drug offenses. So mandatory minimum would be if you were caught with like 5 grams of crack cocaine, you were sentenced 5 years. And then if you were caught with more, it would go to the 3 strikes, which was, I think it was published also in the 80s, which if you were convicted of a crime for 3 times for the same crime, you were sentenced to life. It's to be understood that while crack was sweeping through urban areas, powder cocaine was a popular drug of choice at the time, and it's been stated by scientists that there is no basis for distinguishing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine in a court setting, as they are pharmacologically identical on a substance level. Despite this, 90% of convicted federal crack cocaine offenders are Black, and crack offenses were punished more severely than powder cocaine offenses. The connection between the harsher punishments for being in possession of crack cocaine as well as the mandatory minimum sentencing for drug offenses that soon followed is obvious when looking at it from a closer perspective. The introduction of crack cocaine in Black communities and the sudden heavy criminalization of the drug compared to the criminalization of powder cocaine possession was and continues to be a racist method of withholding basic human rights from Black Americans, one of which being disenfranchising people with felony convictions from voting. And with crack cocaine possession being a felony conviction and 90% of convicted crack cocaine offenders being Black, it's Jim Crow / Black codes ideology is reimagined for the modern era. While the war on drugs contributed heavily to the mass incarceration of Black Americans post-Jim Crow, it was followed by a smear campaign in the media where young Black teens were targeted as future criminals. Deemed super predators, it was a new breed of youth who kill, rape, maim, and steal without remorse. More often than not, the faces of these super predators were Black faces. Furthering the fear of young black boys came the Central Park 5 case. On April 19, 1989, Trisha Melly, a 28-year-old white woman, was attacked and raped in Central Park. She survived despite losing 75% of her blood and suffered from a fractured skull and brain damage. While she retained no memory of the attack, 5 black and Latino teenagers were arrested and convicted for the assault until the charges were dropped in 2002 when Matthias Reyes, a convicted murderer and serial rapist, confessed to the crime while in prison. The Central Park 5 were not only teenagers, the youngest being 14 and the eldest 16, who were arrested and branded as savages, bloodthirsty animals, and human mutations by the general public, but were black and brown boys who were already considered criminals beforehand simply based on the color of their skin and by the rhetoric spread through the media of black and brown communities and the super predator theory. While racist rhetoric and laws are deeply rooted into our legal system, there are efforts to dismantle these ideologies and replace them with laws that benefit not only black Americans, but any Americans struggling in the U.S. legal system. The Stop and Mass Incarceration Network is an organization dedicated to stopping mass incarceration as well as the consequences of racial profiling, laws that disproportionately impact black and Latino citizens, discrimination, as well as the use of prison labor. More controversial and more publicized would be the Black Lives Matter movement. It was founded following the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer in 2013 and is a global organization that dedicates itself to dismantling white supremacy as well as intervening in violence and injustices inflicted upon black communities. Solutions to the high incarceration rate of black Americans of all genders and ages comes down to decriminalizing low-level drug offenses, as well as understanding the war on drugs is not an effective method to stopping drug addiction and only leads to the demonization of addicts. The arrest and prosecution of low-level drug offenses needs to be discontinued and addiction healthcare needs to be prioritized. Low-level drug offenses are usually tied to the personal use rather than the sale of it, and despite it being a minor offense, it makes up a vast majority of the U.S. prison population, a large percentage being black Americans with low-level drug convictions. Rather than treating drugs as a crime, the legal system needs to shift the narrative of drug use being an illness that needs treatment rather than punishment. By stopping the war on drugs, we're putting an end to the negative impacts it has disproportionately had on black communities. It is not an effective method to preventing and stopping drug use, nor is it an effective method to get drugs away from the general public. It has had severe impact on black Americans since its inception and has created policies that have worsened racial disparities in the U.S. prison and legal system. The war on drugs has demonized black Americans struggling with drug addiction, led to a high incarceration rate of black Americans, and has continued to uphold white supremacist ideologies that can be traced back to the antebellum South.